My guest is Leora Norwich. She's a PhD student at Hebrew University, and we're going to discuss Palestinian identity. Welcome to the show, Leora.
Thank you.
How did you get into this subject?
That's a good question. I was actually studying at the London School of Economics, and we were looking specifically at majority-minority dynamics, or divided societies. And rarely is the case of the Arab minority discussed academically. This was in 2005, almost right after the events of October 2000, and yet it really wasn't on our syllabus, and people were rarely discussing it. What I found was starting to go through old newspaper articles from the Jerusalem Post, from Haaretz, from different Israeli newspapers, and that's how I started to discover specifically what was going on. I traced the train back from October 2000 and realized this was really a rich case study that hadn't been fully developed.
But you're doing your case study in a comparative way with Quebec. Why Quebec? Did you grow up in Quebec at all?
I didn't. I grew up in Toronto, and it's a challenge for me because I've often seen antagonisms between francophones and anglophones in Canada, and it was not a case that, for me, for lack of a better term, I was as sympathetic to, or I understood the intricacies of. In that way, it was actually more interesting because I got to develop it rather from scratch. I believed, and I still believe, that it's a case of majority-minority dynamics, and I believe that one of the similar ties between the two cases is that both the Arab minority in Israel and the Quebecois are cases of relative nonviolence. They haven't developed into contentious violence or into communal violence on a high level, and that's a very interesting dynamic to have developed, and I think it's unexplored.
Well, I want to come back to that, but before that, why didn't you pick on minorities within minorities? I mean, the Jewish minority in Quebec, or the new immigrant minorities in Quebec, which are a minority within a minority.
I could have. I honestly feel that any minority community, no matter how homogeneous or heterogeneous, really there's an element of heterogeneity, and there's an element of network analysis that's involved. Looking at the different networks that compose any group, how they go together, how immigrants feed into this or do not feed into this. And so I really wanted to look at ethnic minorities and people who self-label themselves.
Okay, let's go back to this issue of violence then. Why, very simple bottom line, why do you think there has been no real violence in any significant way? Both in Quebec, there was a minor thing with the FLQ, but very minor, and the October incident that you mentioned in 2000, but virtually not any significant violence from the Palestinian Israelis. Why?
Well, I think there has been another couple incidents of violence, like especially, and this is one of the studies that I take quite seriously, is March 1976 and the first Arab Minority Land Day. And I think it's hard to say that there's no violence within Arab minority protest repertoires because increasingly there's stone throwing, increasingly there's blurring over the green line, as people call it. But effectively, yes, these are cases of relative nonviolence. Less than 1% of Arabs in Israel have ever been involved in any terrorist activity, way less than 1%. I think the reason is because both these minorities have a very complicated citizenship dynamic. They take their affiliation to the larger state quite seriously. The Arabs are quite different. The Arabs in Israel are quite different than Arabs in other regions. They've, since 1948, been Israeli citizens. They have full political rights within the state, but they have compromised civil liberties, and there's barriers to their development within the state. Still, this creates a citizenship dynamic where there are conflicting ties. And I think overall, they see themselves as Israeli citizens, while they still call themselves the Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Well, I'll tell you a story about that. I interviewed a Palestinian in Lebanon, and he had been rewarded by spotting the pilot who'd been shot down and telling the Israelis with a trip back to Israel. He could go visit his relatives for 3 weeks. And interviewing him, he said he resented his relatives. And I thought it was because they were still Israeli citizens. It turned out it wasn't that. It turned out, he said in the end, after much discussion, that the real reason is they had women in the room with the men socializing. And he resented that, and he said they weren't Palestinians anymore because of that. So identity is very funny. It's not just citizenship. They become Israeli in a lot of ways in their manners and culture. Isn't that what you find?
That's what I find, and I think very much that the way I look at it blends in also with the larger peace process. The Arabs in Israel are a crucial link to the peace process because, I suppose, a bridge. They share so many cultural ties with Arabs in Israel, with Israelis in Israel, with Jewish Israelis. They speak the language. They work in often similar offices, commerce. But in the same way, they are a link to the Palestinian world, and they're often overlooked in negotiations, in peace negotiations, especially in 1993. That's sort of a prime example.
And you're working on that area?
I work a little bit in what happened, the juxtaposition between what happened in 1993 with Oslo. The Palestinians in Israel, their fate was really sealed inside Israel as citizens of Israel. And to go with that, they're very against land swaps or any sort of transfer from the northern region, from the triangle, because they see themselves as citizens of Israel. But in the same way, they have a say in the larger conflict. They want to see their family. They have cultural ties. They have religious ties.
But they also have the resentment that they're not quite equal citizens.
And they're not.
They have equal citizenship in one sense, in voting in all kinds of ways and before the courts. But in another sense, they don't have the same opportunities. Why don't you think an alternative service system has developed in Israel for them?
Well, initially, Arabs were not to serve in the army because, I think for obvious reasons, because they weren't going to fight against their families in the West Bank or Gaza, because there was a real, there's still a real feeling of the enemy within, or the fifth column of Arabs in Israel. But beyond that, there is increasingly a discussion, especially with the election of the 2009 government, is more of a trend of ethno-nationalism inside the majority community, especially in the Knesset, of trying to bring out or test Arab citizenship in Israel. The loyalty oath would be one, the Nakba, the proposed quote-unquote Nakba law is another, and I think that in that, the national service has arisen, again, as an issue. Now, Arabs in Israel, in a lot of ways, I don't think would be opposed to some sort of national service working within their own communities to improve socioeconomic developments, but they still say that this is not their system, that they are specifically abiding by, and that they are not, this is not their army. They would have no problem serving in an army that represented them, or state that was a state for all its citizens. So that, again, that rhetoric keeps on coming up.
But they are, there's two things going on, because you have this increasing sense of themselves as Palestinian. At the same time, there are increased opportunities in the larger economic and even in the political world. There's now an Israeli ambassador, a Palestinian ambassador of Israel, and several other high positions, though not nearly in proportion to their numbers. What trend do you see happening there?
I don't. Maybe this sounds strange, but I don't so much see a trend. I still see that Arabs are largely marginalized in the Knesset, for sure. And there's been no Arab in the cabinet, for example, and there's been still no Arab minister. Okay, so that's one thing. There's also been repeated Central Election Committee bans of Arab political parties, which are always revoked right before the election, but they set a dangerous precedent. There's obviously a trend towards decreased Arab voting in Israel, and this has happened since 1948. It was quite high, and it's happened since the mid-1970s, maybe even a little bit later, but especially since the events of October 2000. In October 2001, with the elections for prime minister, there was a huge kind of crack in Israel's political planet when the Arabs, only 18% of them actually voted for prime minister. That was a boycott of the election, and that was an example of exit, which the Arab minority is capable of exiting from the Israeli system and asserting their citizenship through absence. So those are one trend. In the same way, the Arab minority is moving increasingly, I see, outside of the bounds of Israeli politics. The civil society is strengthening, Arab civil society, but it's a separate civil society. Some people have called it an ethnic civil society. Others just see it as institutionalizing in and of itself, separate from Jewish civil society. Then there's the Knesset politics. There's 3 Arab parties. There's a fracture there, but they're not really joined with Jewish parties, and the Zionist left is shrinking in terms of Arab votes for it.
Especially with the decline of the Labor Party, where they used to play a small but significant role. And that's changed, because there's no role for them anymore. Let's add, because we have very little time left, with one last and very brief sense of what you think should happen, and be very brief.
I think there needs to be an engagement between majority and minority. I think there needs to be an end to this trend, especially that we've seen since 2009, of delegitimization of Arab political leaders, even of civil society leaders. Increasingly, there's engagement on the small scale between NGOs and civil society, but there is too much separation between the spheres of the Arab world in Israel and the Jewish world. And
with that, I have to cut you off and say thank you, Lior.
Thank
I know you have much more to say. Thanks very much.
Thanks.